This is the situation. We have capsule which is fibrosed in this quadrant, and this area of fibrosis is probably running across to the equator. We have planned toric lens in this eye. How do we go about in such a situation? Let's find out. She is a 65-year-old lady with a long-standing hypermature cataract, and she has got this area of fibrosis which gets very well delineated once we stain with the trypan blue. It wasn't looking so ominous at the slit lamp, but the exact extent of the area of fibrosis gets very well delineated. So the eye is pressurized with chamber and the main incision is being done. Now when you're dealing with such an eye, the challenge is really to get the rhexis right, because as we know, in the areas of fibrosis, the anticapsule tearing is going to be very difficult and it's going to be uncontrolled. There is always a risk that the tear may run towards the equator in an uncontrolled fashion. So these capsules would be difficult to cut, difficult to tear. So I might have to use a lot of variations of technique to get the capsulotomy right in this eye. The eye is being pressurized with the dispersive OVD. The globe is stabilized with a Sinskey hook in my left hand. This is how I do typically. Then with the bent cystitome needle, I'm going to puncture the anticapsule and try to raise a flap. We can clearly see that in the area where there is a fibrosis and also the underlying calcification, the capsule refuses to cut. So I need to go to an adjacent area where the capsule is relatively free of the underlying calcification. I can just make a nick in the capsule and I can raise a sort of a flap. I'm switching my needle with the forceps so that I can control the tear in a better way. The flap is held with the forceps and the tearing of the anticapsule is begun. The control is not great, but somehow I could tear the capsule until I reach and hit this dead end. This is the area of the fibrosis and I can't go beyond it because the capsule just refuses to tear. Let me try from the other end, I thought, but no luck. So this is the area of the capsule which is very firmly adherent. There is a strong underlying calcific plaque which refuses the anticapsule from tearing it. Typically, my next go-to instrument in such a situation would be a micro scissors. So I just want to nick the capsule and see whether I can tear and work around this fibrotic area. So the globe again is stabilized with my second instrument and using the forceps, I'm trying to tear the capsule around the area of the fibrosis. And momentarily I was very happy. I thought this plan is going to work until I reach this dead end. Now this is the area where the fibrosis is extending all the way up to the equator. So again, I have hit a roadblock the second time. So there's no way I can work around this area, because if the moment I try to be a little bit forceful and try to tear the capsule, suddenly the tear changes the direction because I can't tear it in the area of the fibrotic region. The capsule tries to extend towards the equator. Now this tear is, obviously this happens because there's no control and the capsule cannot tear through this fibrotic area. So it has a tendency to run towards the equator where the capsule is relatively healthy. So I need to stop here. This V-shaped tear which we're having, it might not extend up to the equator because there are still fibrotic areas. But still, we want an adequate coverage for our intraocular lens, and I don't want to risk this tear extending further towards the equator. So now how do we deal with this situation? With the typical V shape of the tear now, it is impossible for me to pull it back with the forceps itself, and using a scissors is going to get me a capsular tear which is going to be significantly bigger than what I actually want. Now this is a tough situation and this is a tough capsule, and in such scenarios my go-to instrument has always been the vitrector. So I'm going to demonstrate how I'm going to use vitrector to do the anticapsulotomy in such eyes. This is a 23G cutter which is attached to the Centurion machine. The settings which I'm going to use would be like this. I'm going to use an IA cut mode, irrigation, aspiration, and then cut mode. The flow rate and the vacuum are relatively low, and also I'm going to use a slightly lower cut rate. About 2000 cuts is what I've set the machine for, so that I can get enough grip on this fibrotic and thickened capsule to cut it. The irrigation is going to be maintained by my irrigation handpiece. That ensures that the chamber is being maintained. Even with the cutter, if we are a little bit jerky and if we are a little bit more aggressive in moving the handpiece, there is a risk of the anterior capsular tear being uncontrolled and can run away towards the equator. So it's important to just hold the cutter under the capsule and hold it steadily. And then the cutter does the job for us. The technique is relatively simple, and Vitrector is a wonderful tool to manage such capsules. So the cutter is introduced under the anterior capsule, and under direct visualization, I'm just trying to nibble at the anterior capsule. And we can see that the fibrotic capsule is giving way slowly but surely. And it's a very elegant way of dealing with these fibrotic capsules. That's what I have found out over the years. And I had presented this technique with a large series of cases 4 to 5 years back in one of our conferences. And believe me, this technique is wonderful and very elegant. And we can deal with these capsules in a very atraumatic way and in a very controlled fashion. This is the area where the original V cut was there, and this was at risk of extending towards the equator. Now this area is being dealt with the vitrector, and you can see that acute bend which was there has now been converted into a more smooth with rounded edges, and this part is now not at a risk of extending towards the equator. So we have converted the acute V shape into a more rounded edge which is unlikely to extend towards the equator. Now there is a small bit of thickened calcified zone under the anterior capsule to which the overlying capsule is attached, which is refusing to be cut by the cutter. So this is one place again I need to go back and resort to the micro scissors. Just give a small snip and the flap is free. The capsular flap seems to having an adhesion to the underlying calcific area in another quadrant, which again is snipped with the scissors, and the entire anterior capsule flap is free now, which is expressed out. And now is the time to enlarge the capsulotomy. This flap is relatively healthy, so it could be held with a forceps and then trimmed appropriately. Before emulsifying the nucleus, I would like to enlarge the capsular opening a little bit. So in these situations where the capsule is relatively unhealthy and fibrotic, in these areas I would always like to resort to vitrector, wherein we can cut the capsule without much of a stress on the zonules and with great ease. Of course, the technique is damn simple, and you just have to hold the vitrector under the capsule and just enlarge it in a very controlled way. So in a very elegant way, we could get a decent sized opening even in these areas where the capsule was fibrotic. So now I have a decent sized opening and time to emulsify the nucleus. The edges of these tone capsule are scalloped and with the concavity facing towards the center. So these are relatively strong. See, these edges are unlikely to extend to the equator. So that is not an issue at all. The capsulotomy margin has reasonable strength and it can withstand the intraoperative manipulations which are going to happen during a nucleus management. Time to emulsify the nucleus. The strategy is going to be similar. Initially, I just aspirate the overlying epinucleus and cortex. Then I'm going to use the sculpt settings to create a small central trench. Just to ensure that I get a firmer grip on the core of the nucleus, and then the vertical chop is being carried out. This is the standard process of dividing the nucleus, wherein the chopper goes down vertically and then lateral separation maneuvers are made to crack the nucleus into two halves. The nucleus is divided into smaller fragments, and then the settings are changed to the quadrantrimal mode, and each of these fragments are then emulsified at the level of the rhexis margin in a very controlled manner. So this stuff is routine, which we see in all the cases. The vitrector-assisted capsulotomy margins are strong enough to withstand all these intraoperative maneuvers which are being done during nucleus emulsification. And the emulsification is done and very little cortex is there, which is aspirated quite quickly. Time to implant the lens. Ovaries placed into the bag and the toric intraocular lens is then implanted into the capsule bag. At this point, let me pause the footage for a second and show you the edges of the capsulotomy margin which are there with this vitrector. They have the scalloped margins, so the concavity facing towards the center, and these are of reasonable strength. So the most of the routine maneuvers like inserting intraocular lens or managing the nucleus, dividing the nucleus, all these maneuvers, this edges can easily withstand. So strength of these vitrector-assisted capsulotomy is alright in most case scenarios. The ovary both in front and behind the lens is aspirated. The side ports and the main incisions are hydrated before doing the final alignment of the lens to the corneal markings. The final alignment is being done now. The lens looks to be well centered and in position. The wounds are hydrated. That's it, the case is done. So to summarize, in such a situation where we have zones of fibrosis which are extending all the way up to the equator, we need to resort to multiple instruments, microscissors, forceps, and sometimes vitrector as well. In this case, it demonstrated the utility value of vitrector as an instrument to deal with these fibrotic capsules. It's a great tool to have, very effective, and we can cut the capsule in a very elegant way without much of a stress to the zonules. And definitely, in my opinion, it's a priceless to have in such cases. That was it. Thank you for watching and hope you found this helpful.